coordinator of International Intercultural Education, I have the pleasure of sharing with you many powerful topics. Today is no exception. Please silence your microphones during the presentation. You'll be able to send your questions through the Q&A technology of the Zoom. Your continued attendance at International Intercultural Education Programming could qualify you for recognition throughout the year. To be considered, complete the online evaluation and include your name and contact information. The online address will be on a slide at the end of the program, and it is mccneb.edu/IIEEVAL. Today, we're going to see a troubling documentary about how our American democracy and the right to vote is under systemic attack. Afterwards, we will speak with one of the film's executive producers, Mac Heller, and you will have the opportunity to ask him your own questions. Before starting the American Issues Initiative, Mr. Heller was co-head of the Goldman Sachs Investment Banking Division, and after Goldman, he went on to become executive chairman of Coda Automotive, an electric car manufacturer. His interest in starting the film project stems from his belief in fairness and the simple notion that democracy only works when everyone can vote. His mantra is, voters should choose their politicians, not politicians their voters. Please welcome Mr. Mac Heller, who will introduce the Voter Suppression Playbook.
Thanks, Barbara. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for assembling. And thanks to MCC for hosting this event on this super important topic. I will introduce the film very briefly. It'll take me less than a minute, and then we'll roll it. It's 70 minutes long, and I look forward to talking with everybody about voter suppression and what role it may be playing in the 2020 election after the film. We shot Rigged because we wanted to tell the stories of suppressed voters. I myself wasn't sure this whole thing existed. And one of the ways I learned was to just jump into it and study. And it turns out that there have been laws passed in a number of states with the intent and the effect of preventing some of our fellow American citizens from voting. I regard this as wrong and made the film to tell their stories. Unexpectedly, we also gained access to the people on the other side of this debate, the people who feel that our elections are riddled with widespread voter fraud. And we gained access to them, gained permission to film their stories as well. So it's all in the film. The film was shot during the 2016 election and in the months following. The allegations about voter fraud at that point were about voter fraud taking place at polling locations. This year, it seems that the allegations are centered more on voter fraud taking place by mail-in ballots. So the words are different, but the tune is the same. Let's roll the film. Thank you again for assembling this morning, and I'll look forward to talking on the other side.
I love the vote. It was instilled in us to vote. My grandma raised me up and my sister up to vote. You know, when we turned 18, that was all right.
The address when I registered was 7660 British Circle.
I'm gonna have to have you go and stand in that line so they can update you.
Okay.
All right. Next voter, please.
I need to make sure I do it.
I got an old until I
Is this your address?
She told me I could not vote at all because I got to re-register because I'm nowhere in that system. They're not making it easy at all. It's tiresome. Yeah.
Yep, we got to clean the rolls up one way or another. I happened to stumble across the Phantom Voter Project. I started looking at my neighborhood and started finding what I believe to be a bunch of fraudulent registrations and started investigating them. It's about time we turned the lights on in the kitchen and started cleaning the cockroaches out of here.
When I found out that I was purged off the rolls, and I was highly upset about it. Because, like I said, I mean, I grew up seeing my family vote. I know it's my God-given right today to vote, and I want to vote.
The challenge we have with the average voter suppression issue is that it's happening to people we don't pay attention to every day. And for the average citizen, it's not top of mind because it isn't as sexy, it isn't as violent, it isn't as present, but it can be the most insidious danger to our democracy.
The board found probable cause to go forward on a total of 3,564 voter registrations challenges, all of which were submitted by Mr. Michael Hires.
Yaritza, Burgos, Robin Bruns, Christopher Carmichael, Tina Carmichael, Justin Christopher Carter, Rachel Cheryl Carson, Douglas.
Again, that's 3,564 of those challenges the board found probable cause on to go forward.
This is a big, big win, really, as far as the numbers go. Good golly.
This meeting is adjourned.
I'm Jeffrey Wright. My grandfather, born in 1904, was an oysterman on Virginia's Chesapeake Bay. And he instilled in every one of his children and his grandchildren the importance of the vote. Yes, I'm an actor, but also more importantly, an American, a citizen, a voter. And I'm about to tell you a scary story about how the core tenet of our democracy, one person, one vote, is under attack. Today, American citizens are being wrongly purged from voter rolls, others intimidated not to vote. Meanwhile, state after state has passed new voter restriction laws, making it harder for all of us to vote. How did this happen? And what's the justification for this takedown of America's democracy? Well, this scary story starts in Chicago on a mild November night. The year's 2008.
All right, let's do this thing. Everybody ready?
Ladies and gentlemen, the next First Family of the United States of America.
We have never been a collection of red states and blue states. We are and always will be the United States of America.
The election of Barack Obama most certainly can't be left out of this story. That absolutely was a turning point.
If there is anyone out there who still questions the power of our democracy, tonight is your answer.
That election was such a big moment. It seemed there was this demographic tide and destiny had kind of taken over for Democrats, and that, we were going to see Democratic majorities and presidents into the foreseeable future.
Because of what we did on this day, in this election, change has come to America.
Barack Obama, he said, I'm going to turn red states blue. He said, I will compete in Florida. I'm going to compete here in the South, Virginia and North Carolina. I will have the audacity to challenge the Republican Foundation in Ohio and Indiana. And guess what? The Latino population is growing out here. It is the future of the Democratic Party. I will not only contest for it, I will win it.
Whites in this country have voted Republican in every election since 1968. And for at least since 2000, all of the major minority groups, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, have voted Democratic.
The data is very, very clear here. If you are losing the vast majority of Hispanic voters, and if Hispanic voters are the fastest growing demographic in your country, and you can't appeal to them, you lose. This is very simple. You lose.
The 2008 election was the first election in which people of color were over a quarter of the eligible electorate. African Americans turned out at record numbers.
This is an historic election, and I recognize the special significance it has for African Americans and for the special pride that must be theirs tonight.
we did start seeing some major backlashes against the expansion of the rights to vote after President Obama came into power. I think it has to do with changing demographics, with people having anxiety over the browning of America.
2008 was the beginning of the whole demographic tide, the first election where we could see the demographics impacting. And if we continue to underperform in this multiracial world that is going to be America, the white voters are going to be a clear minority, the Republican Party will cease to exist.
The future looked pretty daunting for Republicans at that time. And so there were those like me who said, you know, we just have to do a better job of being compassionate conservatives, of expanding our ranks. But there were others that took a route where we kind of go down the road of figuring out how you turn out more of your people and less of the other guys.
The road many Republican leaders chose amounts to what we'll call the voter suppression playbook. Since 2010, they've created a number of plays or strategies to counter the rising demographic tide of non-white voters and to discourage younger voters. The first play was codenamed Project Redmap.
The concept was to leverage true national dollars from national donors on the Republican side and invest them in state races, state legislative races, in a way that had never been done before.
In 2010, Redmap sought to change almost 20 legislative bodies to Republican control. To fund that, Chris Jankowski and the Republican State Leadership Committee recruited the Kochs, the billionaire brothers with their own political action group, Americans for Prosperity.
There are about 400 very wealthy individuals now who are allied with Charles and David Koch in a kind of a rich people's political movement. They looked at the 2008 election as a catastrophe.
With some $30 million in funding, Redmap launched the blitzkrieg of attack ads targeting Democrats running for state legislatures.
Americans for Prosperity is responsible for the content of this advertising.
And the 2010 elections really showed that you couldn't compete with all this outside money flooding into these races that could carry the day. And in some of these races was over $200,000 in attack ad money that just flooded into a race that before had never seen more than $50,000 per candidate. And Operation Redmap was looking at what are the states that we need to win the state legislatures and take control of state politics. North Carolina was at the top of the list. North Carolina is the true battleground. Democrats have the edge in terms of voter registration, followed by Republicans, and then independents are the fastest growing group of the electorate.
In the summer of 1999, my children are almost out of the house, and I had always been in politics and other people's campaigns. My grandfather was Speaker of the House many, many years ago here in North Carolina, and I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to run for the House, and I did, and I was elected. In these tough times, my priority is doing what I can to help families deal with rising costs.
Margaret Dixon, fighting for our priorities.
In 2010, North Carolina's Margaret Dixon sought re-election as a state senator. She ended up caught in Redmap's crosshairs.
I had not heard of the Redmap plan at that time. I did not see it coming, and I don't think any of my former colleagues saw it coming either.
Incumbent Senator Margaret Dixon. Who does she really care about? Using her public office to help companies she owned. Special deals, insider trading, no bid state contracts, all for her own gain.
The hooker ad portrayed me as a prostitute. So that was pretty shocking. When the ads came out, I had women come to me crying at the portrayal of a woman candidate in that light.
We took some artistic license. You can take a set of facts and then tell a story that fits your narrative.
And the Redmap narrative worked amazingly well.
Democrats across the nation took a big hit in yesterday's midterm elections, and the same thing is being felt right here in Indiana.
The state Republicans overtook the state House and the state Senate.
There is a complete swing from a Democratic to a Republican majority.
We set a record for any political party in American history in the gain of state legislative seats. We gained over 700 seats in one election.
In the North Carolina Senate, on Election Day, the Senate was composed of 30 Democrats and 20 Republicans. The next day, it was 31 Republicans and 19 Democrats. The only word you can use for that is just tsunami.
We did what we needed to do in 2010, which was take dominant Republican control at the state level.
Red Map focused on the 2010 elections because in 2011, many state legislatures would redraw their voting districts based on the 2010 census, something that happens every 10 years. So partisan redistricting, also called gerrymandering, became the next play. And whoever gerrymanders usually wins.
Gerrymandering involves primarily two different methods of dealing with voters of the opposite party. You can pack voters into districts, or you can crack them into districts to make them ineffective.
Texas is as good an example of packing and cracking as anywhere in the country, particularly the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you look at the map that was originally drawn and approved by the Republicans in 2011. Why would this district from the north that's controlled by Anglos up here in a suburban county, why would it come into Tarrant County like this? Well, it's because they came in and they picked up Latino voters. And you see that they just very carefully pick up this big group of Latino voters, then come back and pick up another group of Hispanic voters like that. This is a classic cracking of Latino voters. Cracking is taking the people of color and cracking them into as many districts as possible where their vote won't make a difference. Packing is putting as many African Americans or Hispanics into as few districts as possible. This shows District 30, which is this packed district. Well, to get a sense of how packed that district is, we're going to shade both African Americans and Hispanics together. So the Black plus Hispanic population, then in purple, you start to see what's going on. You've got a district here that virtually doesn't have anything in it except purple. Classic way of undermining minority voting strength.
If you favor one side over the other, you can clearly take a right turn on Maple Street and a left turn on Mulberry Street and have a partisan impact. It's also an opportunity for the maximum mischief in the line drawing.
The Republicans were able to draw unbelievably precise districts that maximize partisan advantage, where you have a state where the state is relatively even between the Democrats and the Republicans, and yet the Republicans may win 2/3 or 3/4 of the congressional districts. And that's what we're seeing as a result of the redistricting in many states in 2010. The party in power really decides who's going to stay in power. And that's not real democracy. And that's what we have in way too many states in our country right now.
People feel that their vote doesn't count. And gerrymandering makes sure that they feel like their vote doesn't count. Because what happens is you get pushed into a district that is completely safe for one party or the other. And if it's completely safe, why vote?
Now, with their majority secured by gerrymandering, many red map Republican legislatures executed the next power play, passing harsh new voter restriction laws.
What you see is a outcropping across the country of bills in state legislatures that are dominated by Republicans, bills that require new kinds of hurdles that voters have to leap over in order to be able to vote.
In 2011, Wisconsin, a red map state, debated a new voter ID law. The law mandated that those without an acceptable ID, like a state driver's license, would need a birth certificate or passport, social security number, and proof of state residency to vote or register to vote. In short, more hurdles, more bureaucracy, make it harder to vote.
Clerk will read the bill. Senate Bill 7, relating to requiring certain identification in order to vote at a polling place or obtain an absentee ballot, verification of the addresses of electors, absentee voting procedure in certain residential care apartment complexes and adult family homes, identification cards issued by the Department of Transportation.
I got involved when I was very young. My granddad was a Republican, so I said, I'll be a Republican. And he felt it was kind of like this family. So for me, I think it was a sense of belonging, a sense of, hey, I'm working for something.
In 2011, Todd Albaugh was a Republican staffer. He had a front row seat on the passage of Wisconsin's voter ID law.
The chair of the Senate Election Committee at the time. stood up and kind of hit her finger on the counter, and she said, "Look, we got to start thinking about what this is going to mean if this passes to neighborhoods around Milwaukee and the college campuses." What Senator Lozick was referring is, hey, if we can suppress the college vote, and if we can suppress the minority vote in Milwaukee, it gives us a pretty good leg up on any future elections.
And today, this is not a voter ID bill. This is voter suppression. It's voter disenfranchisement. This is voter confusion. This is voter restriction. This is voter discouragement bill.
The term voter suppression was never used in the room, but everybody got the idea of what was being said. Just they could see it on some of these senators, the light in their eye, they got it. Because there are only so many white, straight, old men left. So the only way to win is to scare the shit out of people and to suppress the vote. And I saw it firsthand.
I think the vast majority of our citizens want to make sure that their vote is a legal vote and that all the votes out there are legal votes, because one fraudulent vote cancels out a legal vote.
And so I went to Facebook and said, this is why I left the Republican Party.
So there are all kinds of forms of ID that were permissible prior to these voter ID laws. Now, these voter ID laws are premised on the idea of creating a form of identification that is going to require voters to go through hoops in order to get it. Now, what kind of voters am I talking about? The average middle-class voter will say, I have a driver's license, or I have a passport.
As many as 90% of registered voters have one of these forms of ID. It's in their pocket, and they think, what's the big deal? But here's the thing, 90% of people have it. That means that 10% of people don't.
If you live in rural places and you have to drive, and these motor vehicle offices are few and far between, and they're not open on the weekend, and they're not open in the evenings, and when you get there, then you've got to have the underlying identification that would allow them to give you the ID that you need to vote. For example, that you have to have a birth certificate. Well, some of us have our birth certificate and some of us don't. Some of us wouldn't know how to get it. So it may cost you $15 to get the birth certificate. So you have to now add the travel costs, the time off work, the $15, all to get the voter ID so that you can exercise this right that the Supreme Court in 1886 said was preservative of all rights, the right to vote.
The Supreme Court in 1966 said that a poll tax of $1.50 is unconstitutional. And if that's the case, then our view is no one should have to pay $10, $20, or $40 to get a card so that they can vote.
If we could put ID easily into the hands of every voter in our country, then I wouldn't have a problem with it. But the reality is that getting access to government-issued ID today requires jumping through a lot of hoops and hurdles.
And there's one thing that I think is really worth pointing out, and that's having an ID and having an ID to vote in Wisconsin are very different things.
My name's Molly. If you haven't met me, what I can do is get you everything that you need to vote.
Vote Riders is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization and really focused primarily on voter ID. We're going to make sure everybody can vote.
So we can get you an ID from Wisconsin too, because you need one of those when you go and vote.
I grew up in a household where we're encouraged to be civically active and to vote.
The bill, that's all you need to vote.
And if somebody needs help exercising their fundamental right to vote, we should all be stopping what we're doing and figuring out what we can do as a society to make that better.
Because this is about you, this is about the voters, and the people who are impacted. I can vote, but, you can't. And then I also wanted to talk about when you want to go back to the DMV.
Oh, they want to get the ID.
Zach is one of the voters that I actually met here at First United Methodist Church doing regular community outreach.
I didn't think it would take all this to get an ID to vote.
When President Obama got elected, I voted then, so ever since then I've been trying to vote in every election.
Zach had a pay stub, he had his social security card, but he didn't have a birth certificate.
Let you hold on to these again. Okay, hang on.
Okay. And we went to the DMV, and they still told me I needed my birth certificate. I felt like I had all the right information. They were trying to just have me go around a ringer just for a birth certificate.
Voter ID laws impact certain demographics. They impact low-income voters. They impact voters of color. They impact first-time voters and voters new to Wisconsin. They impact students. They impact older voters who no longer have a driver's license. Here, they make it very difficult to vote. And based on the legislature's own admission and testimony in federal court, that doesn't seem to be a mistake.
The court heard evidence and concluded that there were 300,000 registered voters in the state of Wisconsin who lacked one of the forms of ID is acceptable under the law.
They're trying to make it where only the rich vote for the rich. I thought it was going to be simple, but it wasn't.
The studies are very, very consistent that barriers that you put in front of the ballot box are going to stop some people from voting.
The true objective of voter ID laws in Wisconsin and other states was clear to the politicians passing these laws.
It's something we're working on all over the country because in the states where they do have voter ID laws, you've seen actually elections begin to change towards more conservative candidates.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
Republicans since 1984 in the presidential races have not been able to win in Wisconsin. Why would it be any different?
And now we have photo ID, and I think photo ID is going to make a little bit of a difference as well.
The law is going to kick the Democrats in the butt. If it hurts a bunch of college kids that's too lazy to get up off their boat hunkers and go get a photo ID, so be it.
Right.
If it hurts a bunch of lazy blacks that wants the government to give them everything, so be it.
And it just so happens that a lot of those people vote Democrat.
Gee.
It's astonishing, actually, 50 years plus after the Voting Rights Act was passed, that we still have to do voting rights enforcement and protection.
I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I will send to Congress a law designed to eliminate illegal barriers to the right to vote.
The Voting Rights Act shook up politics. Within weeks of the Voting Rights Act becoming law, Black voters were being registered by the thousands in the South. And within a few years, their voter participation rates were nearly the same as white voters.
After 2010, many red map states enacted voter restriction laws. However, the 1965 Voting Rights Act prevented most southern states from following suit. The act required that those states seek approval or pre-clearance from the U.S. Department of Justice in order to change their voting laws. Well, this was a problem, since the South is key to Republican success. So some of the same conservative groups that fueled Red Map now funded a Supreme Court challenge to the Voting Rights Act. The goal? Do away with the pre-clearance requirement. The case was called Shelby County versus Holder.
First, though, a landmark day for the Supreme Court as it struck down a key section of the landmark Voting Rights Act that was created to prevent discrimination at polling places.
This is a critical day for democratic participation in America. This decision by the court is a game changer and leaves virtually unprotected minority voters in communities all over this country.
When we think something like voting rights is something everybody believes and that progress only goes in one direction, we've seen sudden reverses. We've seen that history can go in the wrong direction.
I mean, the ink wasn't even dry on the opinion. And the next thing you know, the states raced to the clerk's offices with legislation that would do harm to people's rights to vote.
As soon as the Shelby decision was announced, North Carolina legislative leaders said, now we can go for the full bill. And the full bill was the monster vote suppression bill.
So what do we have? We have 53 pages about reducing access and subtracting options, making it harder for people to vote.
There's a care that's exercised, right, around the creation of these laws. And in North Carolina, the Republicans asked for information. They identified those ways of voting that were more likely to be accessed by the African-American community, and those were the ones that they outlawed in that omnibus law.
Legislators asked for the demographics.
And when the Republican Party received the information that the highest percentage, something like 7% of African Americans used the first week of early voting, that's what they cut. Every decision they made it after they knew the impact it would have on African Americans, Latinos, people of color, and poor people.
Some Republicans have admitted that this was a way to make it a little bit tougher on Democratic voters.
And for a moment, I want to have a grown-up conversation about racism. You see, racism is not just about somebody calling you the N-word. Most modern-day racists are too smart for that anyhow. Racism is about policy. Racism is about the ability to take your prejudice and implement policy. Since 2008, we've seen an all-out effort by extremists in suits and ties who sit in political seats working to abridge and deny the right to vote.
I have 500 years of ministry in my family on my father's side. So when I decided to go to college, I picked a school that had no courses in religion. Because I didn't want to go into ministry. I wanted to go to law school, and that was my intention. But I had a very spiritual experience in 1984. I accepted the call to ministry. But it's always been from the beginning, I don't know any way to be Christian without being involved in justice.
What Reverend Barber and other leaders in North Carolina did following the enactment of these vote suppression laws, I think had a big impact in a positive way.
They do not want the people to vote.
Reverend Barber was really at a time where I think many people were demoralized, really being a strong voice, saying, these are fundamental issues that we're going to fight for. And when you had waves and waves of people at the legislature every week willing to be arrested,
I shall not be moved like a tree standing by the road. I shall not be moved.
That was a real sign that they weren't going to let voting rights be given up without a fight.
Nearly 1,200 people went to jail. I was arrested here about 6 times. And I like to connect it because voting rights is not just a black issue. Black and white Republicans and Democrats joined us in getting arrested.
Come on, come on, come on, don't you wanna go?
I am Rosa Nell Eaton, 92 years old. I am before you today to speak on voting rights. I am fed up and fired up. Say fed up, fired up, fired up. Thank you so very much.
And so we had this ritual that at the end of the rally, everybody that was going in to be arrested would line up. So I saw Miss Eaton going in the line with her walker. I was raised in the South, so I'm taught to respect my elders and care for them. I said, Miss Rosenell, you're gonna have to do this. You can sit this one out, we got it. She said, you back up, I got this. And she led about 150 people who all got arrested that day. Rosenell walked with Dr. King. Dr. King encouraged and inspired her. She's registered thousands of people to vote in her life. She's faced the Klan. She wasn't always nonviolent because she had seen the Klan burn crosses in front of her yard.
I remember her standing at the
kitchen counter one day, and all of a sudden I heard her say, "I didn't ever think I would have to go through this again before I got in the grave." And I knew she was dead serious because she thought certain battles were already fought.
To justify new voter restriction laws like North Carolina's HB 589, politicians needed a cover, a compelling reason to fix an election system that wasn't broken. This helped give rise to the so-called voter integrity movement, which took off after Obama's 2008 election.
If you care about vote fraud, gentlemen, we're fighting it. We could use your help.
Thanks.
Hey, if you care about vote fraud, we're fighting it. We could use your help. If you care about vote fraud, gentlemen, we could use your help.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I know a girl who votes 8 times and has $1 million in the bank and is on food stamps and gets everything for free, including college.
How do you know she votes 8 times?
Because we know her. She does.
Would you call me later after the election? Before I launched the Voter Integrity Project, I was a military officer, retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. I became worried that this is a fragile system that depends on people being fair and honest. If you're worried about vote fraud, here's how we're fighting it tomorrow. We could use your help. They're hiding something, and we're on to them. And that's the only question. It's not how many, it's, you know, we know they're doing it. The question is, how big a deal is it? Are they really trying to steal an entire nation? Are they really trying to rig elections in so many states that they can determine the outcome of the presidency?
And a lot of people are going through life with blinders on, or like I used to tell people, it's called the toilet paper tube syndrome. You got toilet paper tubes in front of your eyes, and all you see is that little bit of world right out in front of you through the toilet paper tubes. You don't see what all's going on out here. So if you're looking right here and you're not looking for voter fraud, you won't see voter fraud.
Republicans saw an opportunity where they could go into states and build this notion of voter fraud, get people scared about it, scared enough that they would create new laws that would heighten the threshold to qualify to vote and make that qualification so difficult that it would suppress voters, and not coincidentally people who would vote against them. It's just a very well-organized, well-staffed, well-resourced operation that once they get an idea, they can spread it like a dandelion.
All we're trying to do is protect voter integrity.
We ought to protect election integrity.
Voter integrity
is at stake.
How can you be against election integrity?
There's a lot of people around the country that use this slogan.
We need to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. We want to make it easy to vote.
It's very easy to vote. And we also
believe it should be hard to cheat.
We try to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat.
Because every time a non-citizen votes, it cancels out the vote of a U.S. citizen.
Every non-citizen who votes
cancels out a legally cast ballot.
Every time voter fraud occurs, it cancels out the vote of a lawful citizen and undermines democracy. Can't let that happen.
You didn't have all this talk about fraud until all of a sudden African Americans and Latinos began to vote in record number.
I've called some of the people who advance these arguments without good evidence, members of the fraudulent fraud squad, and they go around making claims that voter fraud is rampant without good evidence to support it. So, and what's the end game? The end game is passing new restrictive voting laws.
I'm Chris Kobach. In order for we the people to take our country back, we need to have fair elections. I will stop voter fraud in Kansas. We need to require photo ID when people vote.
Every state needs a Chris Kobach.
You know, our campaign had an undeniable, unmistakable message: stop voter fraud.
Could you please define voter fraud?
When people say voter fraud, it encompasses a large number of potential crimes. You might be a person who's not a U.S. citizen registering. Then there's crimes on election day, which include things like double voting, voting in more than one state, voting under someone else's name, voting a fictitious identity. The fictitious identity problem, is significant in some states. Actually, voter fraud is substantial in Kansas.
You only proved 9 cases.
No, well, but here you get, so the The cases we've prosecuted are just in the last 2 years using a very small legal staff. We haven't prosecuted all the cases that we could have if we had more attorneys, and we haven't prosecuted all of the many cases that we will never discover.
There is no belief in actual voter fraud. What there is an attempt to restrict voter access that is using the specter of voter fraud, which is hard to prove because it doesn't exist. So you can pretend that the reason no one knows about it is because it's been so effective. So you create this boogeyman that can only be disproven by another boogeyman.
So I looked into how fraud of various kinds occurs. And in particular, I focused in on one kind of voter fraud, pretending to be somebody else when you walk into a polling place. I started the study in 2000, went through 2014. Out of 1 billion ballots cast, I found at the time 31 incidents, credible raising a hand. Somebody has pretended to be somebody else at the polling place. When you dig in, when you actually look incident by incident, a lot of the allegations vanish.
Another analysis found that out of 197 million votes cast for federal elections between 2002 and 2005, only 40 voters out of 197 million were indicted for fraud. As a percentage that is 0.00002%. That's not a lot.
Most voter fraud allegations are driven by what some might term untruths. Others, less generously, call them the big lie.
President Trump again this week suggested in a meeting with senators that thousands of illegal voters were bused from Massachusetts to New Hampshire.
I can tell you that this issue of busing voters into New Hampshire is widely known. It's very real. It's very serious. This morning on this show is not the venue for me to lay out all the evidence.
Joining me now, someone who knows New Hampshire politics very, very well, a Republican who ran the state's party over the last decade, Fergus Cullen. You, sir, on Twitter, are offering $1,000 to anyone who can prove what Stephen Miller was claiming. Do you have any takers?
So far, shockingly, no one has been able to come up with any evidence, no pictures of one of these magic buses delivering hundreds, if not thousands, of people from Massachusetts to New Hampshire. No one has any evidence at all.
You know, the buses are red meat to some activists. I got a call from somebody going, hey, there's buses. They urged me and begged me to get over here as fast as I could to check it out. But I don't see any buses.
In New Hampshire, I've seen it. I've seen busloads
Again, I mean,
of people.
this is where we keep coming back to.
Based on what I've seen with my own eyes, busloads of people coming in, whether they're illegal, meaning they came into the country illegally, or they're illegal voters.
You saw that.
Well, I know Josh has seen it, yeah, and I've seen it too.
Josh, did you see busloads and busloads of people coming in from somewhere else?
I wouldn't characterize it as busloads and busloads.
Billy, are you sticking with that you've seen busloads or no?
I have seen busloads. Yeah, I guess I can't cite the busloads that I've seen and where I've seen them, but on television I've seen it.
Something significant shifted in America over the last decade or so. And it's pretty simple. It shifted from people thinking there was opportunity to thinking that opportunity is being taken away from them. That others, you define that however you want, are coming across the borders or from wherever, and they are changing our way of life. One place I can lay that blame is to say people are stealing elections. Those other people, that other party, those people that are trying to take stuff away from me are doing it illegally. Because people don't want to say it's, you know, people don't want to admit that life changes.
What a great place. Thank you very much. So we have thousands of people outside trying to get in, but we should start. Do we agree?
We're fighting vote fraud. If you are interested in that.
Of course, we were worried about vote.
Yeah, I am too.
We're worried about
Read
vote
that.
fraud in North Carolina.
But people will. They'll vote many times. Somebody coming up and voting 15 times for Hillary.
I think he's going to win unless the only way she can win is if she steals the election.
That's what I'm afraid of too, which is why you need to read that and decide if you want to fight vote fraud, if you care about it.
And I will not tell you to vote 15 times. You won't vote 15 times.
In 2016, for the first time, a major party presidential candidate, Donald Trump, and his vice presidential running mate, Mike Pence, were preaching the gospel of voter fraud and rigged elections.
Do you agree with your running mate, Donald Trump, that polling places in this country are going to be rigged?
In recent years, we've had instances, proven instances of voter fraud, and that's why.
The 2016 election offered a perfect opportunity to see how the voter suppression playbook was working in real time.
The first stop, North Carolina.
My name is Michael Evan Hires. I'm a 100% disabled veteran. I'm not married. I have the time, I have the skills, and have a desire to make sure that every American vote is legally cast.
The Voting Integrity Project is interesting. They've always had a bit of a gadfly, renegade, vigilante voter fraud, crusaders. They claimed that thousands of non-citizens were voting in the state where they would challenge voters at county boards of elections, and then they couldn't prove that really any of those were true.
Is there anyone in the audience today who received a notice that if they wished their name not to be removed from the voter rolls, they should be present? Stand up then and give us your name, please.
Randy Burkett.
Okay, sir. John Mckeithen.
Well, North Carolina has a provision where a citizen can challenge the right of another citizen to vote. It's been on the books forever. Who else is going to know who's registered to vote unless another citizen does it?
Some of the laws that wind up being discriminatory today had discriminatory intent when they were first written in the early 1900s as part of the Jim Crow laws. For example, voter purging laws to cleanse the rolls.
And this was typically used in the Jim Crow era by whites who were trying to prevent newly enfranchised African Americans from having access to the ballot box.
Michael's methodology involves finding voters that the state identified as inactive.
These people have missed 2 federal elections, so they were listed as inactive. And I started sending letters to these inactive voters on the Cumberland County voter rolls.
The ones that came back marked by the post office as undeliverable are considered evidence that the voter no longer resides at that address. And Mike challenged those voters.
Voter challenge envelopes were marked "Do Not Forward." If a resident moves in the district, even across the street, he or she will not receive the notice their registration is being challenged, or even know to come to the Board of Elections hearing to contest the challenge.
Now let's move on to Mr. John Lamont Mckeithen Jr.
Some people have the knack of spotting anomalies. It's kind of like seeing a lump of coal in a bale of cotton. It'll just pop right out at you.
Let me just ask you, what do you want this board to know concerning your place of residence?
I do live and have lived at 7790 Stone Point Road.
It says 7790.
Okay, this says 7770.
Is there a possibility that people got struck from the rolls mistakenly because the post office did not appropriately deliver the mailings to them? There is a small possibility on that.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give concerning this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All the evidence shows that when someone is purged from the rolls, it's extremely unlikely that they're going to re-register. It's hard to get them to re-register. And I worry that it will diminish the will to participate in the political process.
And the danger is if states use unreliable information to take voters off the rolls, and if they do not give voters adequate notice and an opportunity to contest their removal, then we could have a situation where hundreds or even thousands of legitimate voters are being taken off of the rolls without their knowledge.
To reverse Mike Hires and Jay Delancey's voter purge, as well as purges in other North Carolina counties, Reverend Barber and the NAACP asked a federal court to intervene.
Good morning. Persons were engaging in an attempt to get voters purged, especially African Americans. We are fighting this. We believe and we hope that the courts will agree with us and we will have an immediate temporary restraining order.
Reverend Barber, that guy's made a name for himself. Congratulate him on a well-funded. He has a lot of out-of-state funding money, and he knows how to play that race card better than anybody I've seen. And really since the heyday of Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. He has played that race card so well.
The NAACP filed a voter suppression lawsuit against the North Carolina Board of Elections, and today they won that case with a federal judge declaring that all voters purged from the voting rolls must be reinstated.
The NAACP in North Carolina, they filed a lawsuit in federal court, and actually they went judge shopping. They found a black female judge that they could influence emotionally, in my opinion, and not so humble opinion at that.
Those of us who are the descendants of people who had their cars blown up outside of churches right here in North Carolina when they were inside the church organizing for voting rights. When you come from that kind of lineage, you're not going to allow some loudmouth bigot to intimidate you.
The courts have said, you know, you can't do any of this kind of stuff in the last 90 days. But they're going to put all these names back on the roll. We had a guy who worked for 2 years and got over 6,000 names removed in Cumberland County.
And they claimed that we were targeting blacks. I would be glad to get drug into federal court because that will give me the opportunity to expose the problems that we have in this state. I get 3 hots and a cot and full medical care if I go to jail. Except how are you going to put me in jail for following the law?
The next stop, Rock Springs, Texas. Here, a local sheriff seemed to be practicing an old-fashioned but effective voter suppression technique, voter intimidation.
The whole idea is to make voting seem like a dangerous proposition, that it's something that might get you in trouble. And again, what that does is over a period of time, it insulates Republicans against the effect of African-American Hispanic population growth.
In Edwards County, Texas, we received reports that the local sheriff who's connected to the militia movement and who prides herself on being, you know, this tough cowgirl sheriff, she had actually engaged personally in efforts to intimidate voters.
The issue of voter fraud has been very prevalent since I've been here. They're tired of, you see it, you know it, everybody around you knows it. Why isn't someone doing something about it?
Who's 814?
Thanks for you.
814, how long has he been here?
He's been here since the first of the month.
Since the first of the month?
Yeah.
The sheriff has alleged people voting incorrectly that have not. She has threatened to investigate people for illegal voting that have not. She has someone in jail now.
I'm not guilty of nothing because I did the right thing. As I went to go do it, I asked.
The gentleman is under arrest for voter fraud and voter impersonation. He's accused of impersonating his grandfather. There's no way a 40-year-old man is going to be mistaken for someone who's almost 100 years old.
In the first case, he went to prison for delivery of a controlled substance. Once he was on parole, he pretty much knew he wasn't supposed to vote. It was just probably catch me if you can or ha, ha, ha. I don't really know the motive behind it. I guess maybe one day he'll tell us. But at this point, he's just kind of trying to play the victim.
I do feel that it was a mistake that was done by the ladies working the poll in not actually comparing the date of birth. The date is clearly stated on the registered list as 8/9/1915.
Now, Manuel was on parole. He should not have voted, but the election officials shouldn't have allowed it either. He asked if he could vote. That tells me that he didn't know if he could or not.
The intimidation comes in the arrest itself. Him sitting in jail would send a very strong message to a lot of people and intimidate a lot of people as to not to go out and vote.
You have leg restraints, or I think Sheriff wanted him in leg restraints.
So, Sheriff, she has been diligently trying to root out the corruption ever since she took office over here. She already has. We've had more arrests ever. Perhaps this might make Some of the people who are entertaining the idea of voting illegally, it may wake them up and say, hey, they're not going to let me get away with it if I get caught.
This county has the highest rate of voter fraud allegations with the Secretary of State and the Attorney General's office than any of the other 254 counties in the state. Houston's got 10 million people in it. We've got 1,100, and we have a higher rate of voter fraud? Please.
And there was one additional stop before Election Day 2016, Jefferson City, Missouri, where state legislators were debating a voter ID requirement for the November ballot.
2006, there were only 2 states in the country that had what I'd call a strict voter identification requirement. And then all of a sudden, after the 2008 election, we have a wave of laws, unheard of virtually, that make it harder for people to participate and in almost every instance disproportionately hit precisely these segments of the electorate that are emerging. So it's hard for someone like me to look at that and think this is just a coincidence.
House Bill 1631 has been from the very start about integrity in our election process here in Missouri, pure and simple. House Bill 1631 is the implementation of photo voter ID in the state of Missouri. Implementing procedures to safeguard against fraud helps ensures that qualified registered voters' votes are not diluted by unlawful activity.
And what is that?
That is what photo ID is trying to do. So you think protecting against fraud is a bad idea?
I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, gentlemen. We have protections against fraud right now. Stop trying to confuse people and sensationalize an issue to back up your point of view. Be intellectually honest about what's going on.
Where are you coming from on this
What can you point to? What voter identification fraud can you point to that's happened in the state of Missouri that your bill would address?
How do you, without this implementation in effect,
That's what we call a non-responsive answer because you did not respond. That's okay. I understand. I would implore the body to think real hard about their vote on this and ask them to vote no. Thank you.
All those in favor will vote yes. All those opposed will vote no. Mr. Clerk, please ring the bell and open the board. Mr. Clerk, please close the board and tally the vote. By your vote of 115 yes and 41 no, you have sustained the gentleman's motion.
And so in order to maintain political control, in order to maintain the systems that we have that benefit white people, it means that we have to, as a country and as a system, be able to keep people of color from voting and from their full political power.
To say that our intent is to try to disenfranchise any individual in the state of Missouri is completely absurd. That is a very serious accusation and very, it's something that I don't take lightly. Your vote is your own, and it's extremely important in a democracy. I'm just trying to put more integrity into our voting process.
We're very honored to have the Reverend Cassandra with us.
I wear this shirt. My mom's name was Carrie. My mom was, I was born in a little town in Alabama, 47 miles from Selma. My mother was a voter rights worker. I really used to get sick of my mom's stories about what it meant to be in Selma and how she marched and how she was there before Dr. King. Mom, I don't want to hear about Selma anymore. I mean, we got it made now. We can actually go and vote. So I thought. Voter restriction laws are designed to take us back to the time that my mother was fighting in Selma. It's dancing on the grave of civil rights workers who gave their lives so that people could vote. It is not just about photo ID. That is code word for let's cut out some citizens. And who are the legislators to get to decide who gets to have a right that they already have? Let's vote no on Amendment 6. So you voted yes on Amendment 6? Oh, you voted no. Okay, great. Yeah.
In the summer of 2016, while Missouri mulled the pros and cons of voter ID, federal courts struck down or modified a number of the more restrictive voting laws passed after 2011.
In another important story tonight, North Carolina's law requiring voters to show photo ID was thrown out by a federal court that said the law was designed to bar Black Americans from the polls. This is the third time this month that similar laws were struck down, the others in Texas and Wisconsin.
These court decisions frustrated advocates of voter suppression legislation. The next play would need to include changing the federal courts, but that would have to wait for another day.
It's a Tuesday morning, but not just any Tuesday morning, Election Day.
Good morning, America. Election Day 2016.
Election Day officially starts right now.
Who did you vote for?
Tough decision.
If Hillary wins, I'm done, probably. I don't know what will happen, but it scares the crap out of me because if she wins, I'm afraid I'll be hunted down like a dog.
You took it. Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate you coming.
Morning. My name's Michael Hires.
Michael Hires. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Well, you may not think so when you go back and research my name, but I'm the fellow that's been filing the voter challenges. Let's face it, there are unscrupulous people out there, and they could go to the polls and impersonate somebody. I'll tell you what,
It's a pleasure.
if I could get more people of all, I don't hate to say race because we're all the human race,
Yes.
but more ethnic backgrounds involved in this, that way people wouldn't be taking pot shots at me. The NAACP is hot as a pistol at me right now, claiming I'm suppressing the black vote.
Well, I think you would.
They're accusing me of targeting minorities.
Okay.
They're trying to throw mud on the wall and trying to get it to stick. But if you're interested in getting involved, look up voterintegrityproject.com.
I will remember that. Right now, I have to go on late for work.
Okay. Well, have a good day.
Have a wonderful day.
Right now, we're delivering election equipment. I wonder if we can put that tabulator right here. Ready? We can't let it drop.
Hey.
How's everything going?
Good.
You on top?
I don't know. Wherever God tells me to do, that's all it's going to be.
What's the first president I voted for? Al Gore. See how that turned out, right?
Have here. I got my documents.
All right. Voting with my son.
Oh, we did. First time, right? Good stuff.
What we're going to try and do is have data collectors sitting there passively collecting data on license plate numbers. See if we can figure out which people, if any, are going from voting location to voting location. The illegitimate reason would be if someone is what we call a serial voter and going from location A to B to C, using a different name at each one. And what we want to know is how prevalent is this?
See any vote fraud?
Not yet.
I got to take this. Hey, Jim.
Have you seen any fraud, heard of any fraud?
No, we have not. No, with only 6 data collectors, the odds of getting someone who showed up at 2 locations are slim and none.
When would you you say to Jada Lancey and Mike Hires?
Basically, if you want to challenge me, please contact me first. A challenge is a challenge, and if I challenge you to a chess match, I need you to play with me. At least come back. Show me what you got. So,
Missouri becomes a voter photo ID state, with Amendment 6 passing with 64% of the vote.
It looks like it's going to be a loss for us, and it's really a loss for the people. I believe that the right to vote is sacred, so I'm really grieved in my spirit right now. Not a lot has turned around in Missouri in the last 40 years, except in the wrong direction.
Got one. Pamela Elliott, Republican, 61.8% of the votes. John Harris, Democrat, 38% of the votes. Just blessed, really. How's Trump doing? Good? Good. Awesome.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next president of the United States, Donald Trump. Thank you. It's been an honor. God bless. Thank God.
President-elect Trump has been quite active on Twitter, and he said, in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally.
The president-elect is absolutely correct when he says the number of illegal votes cast exceeds the popular vote margin between him and Hillary Clinton.
Our next guest, Greg Phillips, first tweeted the claim that 3 million people voted illegally. Do you know, and can you prove right now, that 3 million people voted illegally?
Yes.
Do you have the proof?
Yes.
Will you provide it?
Yes.
Can I have it?
No.
If you look at voter registration, you look at the dead people that are registered to vote, you're going to find, and we're going to do an investigation on it.
But 3 to 5 million illegal votes.
Well, we're going to find out, but it could very well be that much.
After the 2016 general election, I called all 50 secretaries of state, managed to reach 49 of them, and never found more than 1 or 2, at tops 3 or 4, suspected instances of fraud. Not proven, but suspected or alleged. Many states had none at all.
Recall that what curtailed widespread voter suppression in the 2016 elections were rulings by federal courts overturning or amending many of the new voter restriction laws. And now, with a Republican Senate and White House, Republicans could nominate and confirm their own judges. A new day was coming.
Welcome, everyone, especially the nominees and their families, to today's nominations hearing. We'll hear from 4 nominees to district courts.
President Trump has set a record for the most number of judges named to the courts of any first-year president ever in American history.
But think of 145 district judges. That's world-changing, country-changing, USA-changing, and we have unbelievably talented, smart, great people being put in those slots.
And so whatever protection against voter suppression is coming from the courts is going to be eroded by the impact of this vast wave of Trump judges.
And the Democrats are decades behind Republicans in terms of recruiting and thinking about how to control the judiciary.
I mean, the Federalist Society in many ways is writing the lists of judges for the Trump administration to pick from. The Federalist Society is the creation of billionaire right-wing funders like the Kochs. They helped get it off the ground in the first place.
Republicans have found a formula that's allowed them to win, even though the demographics of the country are changing. We can reassure ourselves that those strategies can only work for so long, but the question is for how long? And what if so long is a very, very long time?
The voter suppression playbook is complete. It's part and parcel of the same malevolent and dark strategy. Cut a few voters here, a few voters there. Discourage others from even taking the time to cast a ballot. In short, undermine the sacred American principle of one person, one vote.
So just to finish up, you see what's happening? The process is rigged. This whole election is being rigged.
As Donald Trump has said so many times, the elections are rigged, but in a much different way than he claims. They're rigged to stem the rising demographic tide of non-white voters and to discourage younger voters. Clearly, the voter suppression playbook is working all too well.
We need all of our institutions of power to protect the right to vote. We need the legislature to protect the right to vote. We need the executive to protect the right to vote, and we need the courts to protect the right to vote.
When you deprive people of the right to vote, the vote being the very fiber of this wonderful quilt we call democracy, when you begin to tear the threads away, saying this person can't vote, that person can't vote, that person can't vote, the next thing you know, you will not have a democracy.
I think our founding fathers were brilliant. And I think they put in guardrails of democracy to keep the crazy out. Now, I think we're being sorely tested. And we're going to see how strong those guardrails are because they've never been tested like this.
But that's the nature of democracy, that it's not static. It doesn't just stay free and open because it's a democracy. It's because every day you fight to keep it open. Every day you have to put your shoulder to it.
We have to dream about the democracy we want to have. We have to say, whose side are you on in this fight for a robust democracy?
People don't understand why it's so important that this experiment we call the United States continues. Then you say, well, it's always been this way in my life, so I'm sure America's going to continue the same way. Well, are you?
The right to vote isn't partisan. It is an important part, and it's in fact a bedrock part of our democracy. The people own the agency to participate in their government.
And until we can say, without doubt, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, until that means exactly what it says, we are still working toward becoming a more perfect union.
If you want to know more about what you can do to defend America's democracy, go to our website, riggedthefilm.com. I'm Jeffrey Wright. Thanks for watching.
So as the credits roll, I'd like to welcome you back.
I hope you found Rigged informative, engaging, and hopefully motivational. The topic we have for our question and answer discussion is democracy in the time of COVID and how America and Nebraska will adapt to this new reality of voting and maintaining a democracy during a raging pandemic. If you would like to ask a question of executive producer Mac Heller, please submit it in the Q&A function on Zoom. You've already met Mr. Heller, so I'll start with a first question that we have. Your film explains the ins and outs of voter suppression, but can you help us better understand how voter suppression is a manifestation of systemic racism? As Reverend Barber says in Racism is about the ability to take your prejudice and implement policy. Since 2008, we've seen an all-out effort by extremists in suits and ties who sit in political seats, working to abridge and deny the right to vote. Mr. Heller?
Barb, call me Mac, please. Systemic racism, serious statement, but here's how I look at it. Voter suppression is a system of laws and administrative regulations and informal practices that work together in a concerted manner to deny some of our fellow citizens the right to vote or impede their right to vote. And it has the intent and effect of falling hardest on our fellow citizens of color. So it is systemic, and it can be, and frequently is, racist in its intent and in its effect. So that's systemic racism. So that's kind of a dictionary reaction to your question. I'll give you two other reactions as a filmmaker. One is you have to think about the historical elements of this. We don't in the film dwell on the events of 1965, we mention them, and we don't dwell on the events of 1865, but they're there. And a lot of these practices have their precursors in provisions in the Jim Crow era at the end of the 19th century, or even before. Felon disenfranchisement being one very important one. So, the two things I would want to add to my kind of dictionary answer is the history, and the second one is the metaphors. So you hear Mike Hyers in the film say, it's about time we turned the lights on in the kitchen and started getting the cockroaches out of here. Well, who are the cockroaches? It's like finding a lump of coal in a bale of referring to, as he puts it, anomalies. These metaphors of contamination, of contagion, of disease, referring to Black Americans participating in our democracy, they are right out of 1898. We did a lot of research and spoke with a number of academics in North Carolina about the derivation of the Purging Law that we document in the North Carolina Purge. And one thing we had but didn't put in the film was the newspaper headlines of the time, saying the new law would be really good to cleanse the voting rolls of the handful of remaining African Americans still registered to vote. The implication being that the presence of those names on the rolls was dirty, and to remove them would be to cleanse. So that metaphor flows right from 1898 to some of the clips that we have in the film, and that's concerning to me. My first reaction, in a very long answer, sorry, is that it is systemic. It can be racist, frequently is, so it's systemic racism, but look at the history and listen to the metaphors. Sorry that was so long, Barb.
No, we appreciate your answer, and good news, there are questions flowing already. So let's go to our audience questions from Kanisha. Can you further explain packing and cracking and how this is accomplished?
Yeah, this is a little bit complicated, but it is super important. And Nebraska is frankly not a good example of gerrymandering, but Pennsylvania is and Wisconsin is. So packing means, let's say I'm a Republican and I want to elect as many Republican, I'll take the state of Mississippi. Mississippi has either 5 or 6 congressmen. Let's say it's 5. And the redistricting has been done in Mississippi by the Republican legislature. And what they did was, and Mississippi, by the way, is a state that is roughly 35% African-American. One of the highest African-American percentages, might be the highest African-American percentages. But out of the 5 congressmen, and again, maybe it's 6, only 1 is African-American. Well, how did that happen? Well, the guys drawing the district looked at where African-American voters are concentrated in Mississippi, and it's in one particular area, largely around Jackson, the state capital. They're throughout the state, but the greatest density is in Jackson. So they drew a district, as Matt Engel says in the film about Dallas-Fort Worth, that doesn't have much in it except African-American voters. And that district will always have, has always had a African-American congressman. His name is Benny Thompson. And that's packing. And Benny Thompson wins his races 80-20 or 80-15. And so the way the redistricting people think of that is that they've managed to create a situation where a lot of Democratic votes are wasted because Benny Thompson's being elected with 80% of the vote, whereas 51% would have won the race. And then you could take that other, whatever it is, 29% of Democratic votes and put them in some other district where they could change the total. So pack all the people from the other party into one district where their votes will elect one guy out of the 5, but not anybody else. And then you have a situation where every other district in Mississippi has, 20% African Americans. And those districts are 80% white, and they will always in Mississippi elect a Republican congressman. And so that's cracking. The remaining African-American votes in Mississippi have been cracked into those other 4 districts where they won't have much power at all. So that's packing and cracking. It can take place along racial lines, party lines, other ethnic lines, and it's been a very effective way. Pennsylvania, which is a state that's pretty much a 50-50 Democrat-Republican state, coming out of the 2011 gerrymandering, the votes were always within a couple of points of 50-50, but the 18-seat congressional delegation was mysteriously 13 Republican and 5 Democrat. And the Democrats sued because it was improperly gerrymandered in their opinion. The courts agreed, and in 2018, the court drew new lines, and lo and behold, the state has a congressional delegation of 9 and 9. So that's the power of this. 13 and 5, once put into fair districts, became 9 and 9. Again, less important in Nebraska, but North Carolina, Wisconsin. I'll give you one other example of packing and cracking. The Wisconsin state legislature, heavily gerrymandered. In the 2018 election, 45% of the votes were cast by Republicans and 52 by Democrats. So the Democrats won 52-45 over the Republicans, taking all the state legislature votes as a whole. Did the Democrats win 52% of the seats? No, they did not. They won 37% of the seats, and the Republicans with 45% of the vote won 63% of the seats. So if this coming presidential election is close and gets hung up, and the state of Wisconsin is too close to call, and as the Constitution says, the vote gets thrown into the Wisconsin state legislature, then 45% of the votes for the state legislature will have won 63% of the seats, which will then commit 100% of the state's electoral votes. So if you want to think about gerrymandering, think of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mac. Now we have from Adrian. What can one do to raise awareness and ensure young, new voters in particular take proactive action to counter these practices portrayed in the documentary?
I think this is going to be a huge election for young voters because people have understood that whatever it is you care about, it's on the line in this election. So, and whichever way you feel. So I have found that the most effective appeal to younger voters in terms of persuading people that they should vote is to approach it through an issue, whatever issue is most important to them. It may be climate change. It may be gun ownership rights. It may be healthcare. It may be education. It may be, any number of things, but helping people understand that national policies and state policies and local policies are all determined by the vote that they either cast or they don't cast. And by the way, it's obviously your freedom not to vote. But if you don't vote, I can assure you that the people on the other side of your issue, they're going to vote. And if you want their opinion to prevail, fine, stay home. But if you want your voice to matter, then you have to vote. And by the way, voting alone may not be enough. You need to show up at the city. If you are uncomfortable with the criminal justice system or the policing system in your town, show up at the city council meetings and learn how the system works and understand how your input can best be heard. And it starts with voting. And for most of us, it starts with one particular issue.
Excellent. Particularly this time, I'm really interested in hearing from the young voters. I'm excited. And for those of you who are in that category out there, please vote and do encourage others to. So we have a couple of questions from Anonymous. What do you think about the Republican Party putting up ballot return boxes throughout California? Is this a new and ingenious method of voter suppression?
I live in California. I'm in California right now. I was born and raised in Ohio. Barb knows that my mother was born and raised in Omaha. But I live in California now. And we've seen that headline. This may be benign. It may be an effort to help people deposit their ballots. And then let's say it's happening at a gun store, which is where apparently at least some of them are. I guess the plan would be that the gun store owner then takes those ballots and takes them to the Board of Elections and hands them in. That's sometimes called ballot harvesting, where I go around my neighborhood and tell my neighbors that I'd be happy to drop their ballot for them, and some of them give me their ballot and I take them in and I do it. The danger of ballot harvesting is that there have been cases, I'm not aware of any in California, but there was one in North Carolina recently where somebody was harvesting ballots and is alleged to have looked at who they were harvesting them from, made a judgment about what party they would be voting for, and illegally throwing away ballots that he thought would be cast for the party that he opposed. That's obviously illegal, should be illegal. The guy in North Carolina was caught. There's no evidence that any of that has been going on with the California drop boxes, but it's early days in the investigation. I'm confused by the California thing, and if that happened, it would be suppression, to answer your question. I'm confused by the California thing because on the outside of the boxes, it said official ballot drop box. And I think that word is misleading because it wasn't official. It was not official in the sense that the state of California put it there. So, I mean, I put my ballot a few days ago in a drop box at the town hall in our small town. And I know that to be an official drop box because I looked on the Board of Elections website and found the address and found the box, and there you go. And it was locked and sealed and tamper-proof and a whole bunch of other things that I know are the traits of ballot drop boxes in California. So I'm a little concerned. I am concerned about these, what I'm going to call private drop boxes, non-official drop boxes. It's possible that they will have some bad intent to them, but it's too early in the investigation to know. And so we'll find out. I'm glad it's been exposed early. I don't know how many ballots have been dropped. If you dropped your ballot in one of those boxes, I don't know what you're supposed to do. In California, by the way, we can track our vote by mail ballot. So I can go online, which I've done, and confirm that my ballot has been received at the Board of Elections. And then later on, I'll confirm that it's been tabulated. So those citizens can do that, but not everybody has the energy to do that. So I'm concerned about it. I'm concerned about this story.
So Mac, when it's done right, what's wrong with voter ID? It's not hard to register.
I'm not against voter ID. I'm against, as Michael Waldman says in the film, I'm against requiring a bunch of IDs that a bunch of people don't have. All the studies, all the litigation tell us that approximately when you have what I'm going to call a strict ID law, obviously there are, a forest of different laws, 20 or 25 different laws. But when you require IDs that 10% of the population don't have, then you're disenfranchising 10% of your citizens. I think that's wrong. I think every eligible American citizen has the right to vote. And by that, I mean everybody. Now, I've got my driver's license right here. I've got my passport over there in the file cabinet. This is no trouble for me. But for 10% of our citizens, it is trouble, either because they're older or younger or poorer or less I'm really organized. And I think they get to vote. I really think that they get to vote. And so I am opposed to laws that disenfranchise any of our citizens, and certainly 10% of our citizens. And I think every American would be. And so I say to myself, what problem are we solving? Because I've been voting a long time, and for decades, you could establish your identity at the polls by bringing a bank statement or a utility bill or a social security card or any kind of common sense. Sometimes they'd send you home saying, that social security card isn't enough. I need your driver's license. And of course, there was a time when your picture wasn't on your driver's license. And there was not a problem with voter fraud. I'm going to repeat that. There was not a problem with me going to the polls and impersonating someone else. And there isn't a problem with that today. So what problem are these ID laws solving? So I think of it as a cost benefit. The cost is you're disenfranchising some percentage of your citizens. It may be 10%. 10%, who cares? Well, in Texas, that's 1.7 million people, right? In Wisconsin, it was 300,000 at the time of the litigation. In Pennsylvania, 400,000. In North Carolina, 400,000. These are all findings of the federal courts about how many people didn't have the ID called for by the law. The other thing, Barb, is that I've read the legislative history of these laws in North Carolina and Texas. And in each case, the legislature asked for information on what citizens held what kind of ID. And they said this one qualifies, that one doesn't qualify. So the famous story is that in Texas, so the requirement is a government issued photo ID. And if you're a student at the University of Texas, your student ID is government issued because it's the University of Texas and it has your photo. So it's a government issued photo ID. And you think of all the process and vetting and checking that goes on in somebody becoming a student at the University of Texas. It's a lot. Students at the University of Texas are majority minority, meaning there are more minority kids than white kids. So the legislature looks at that and says, no, that ID doesn't qualify for voting. Concealed carry license in the state of Texas also is government issued, also has your picture on it. By the way, it can be given to non-citizens, as can a University of Texas ID, but concealed carry licenses are okay for much less vetting than getting into the University of Texas. And by the way, they're okay for voting, that ID, 86% held by white people. And that pattern exists in the IDs that were in the acceptable, unacceptable columns in Texas and in North Carolina. Same way with these laws on how people vote. In North Carolina, people voting on Sunday are more likely to be African American. Well, they got rid of much of the Sunday voting. So I've just gone into it and I've said, this doesn't smell right. So with voter ID, you got to start with what problem are we solving? Because it's not a fraud problem. What problem are we solving? It's not a identifying yourself problem, because that's been done for decades with bank statements and utility bills. No one's caught for fraud presenting, several types of identification of somebody else, not to mention doing it multiple times. So I suspect that the intent of this is to disenfranchise some citizens, and that has in fact been the case. So that's my problem.
We appreciate your going into the depth and helping us to see the complex nature of the answer there. We have a request to make sure that our audience knows that in Nebraska, you can also track your ballot to confirm that it's received. So everybody out there should be checking on that. We know that early voting is very popular this year. So I know that I'm going to track mine. I just had it deposited yesterday. And another anonymous attendee states that this problem is mostly affecting Democrat voters. Are there any Republican politicians or prominent Republicans who are also speaking out about this problem? And I know based on some conversations that we had this week, Mac is probably happy to hear that question so he can talk about the nonpartisan nature.
I'm old enough that I think of the Republican Party as the party of voting rights. Obviously, it was the Democrats who administered the Jim Crow system in the South. And it was the Democrats who stood in the way of civil rights legislation for many years until in 64, 65, these laws were passed by combined Democrats and Republicans, but the Republicans were the key votes in overcoming the no votes of Southern Democrats. So I think of the Republicans historically as the party of Lincoln, the party of voting rights. It has been and indeed, as the Voting Rights Act came up for renewal multiple times since 1965, it was a bipartisan effort, but the Republicans were more than equal partners in it. The greatest was in the most recent renewal in 2006, when I think it passed by 96-3 or 96-0 or something like that in the Senate, with the famous, probably 92-year-old former segregationist Strom Thurmond voting in favor of the Voting Rights Act renewal. And he, at that point, had become a Republican. We worked hard to find Republicans to speak about voting rights in this film. And of course, we have Mark Mckeithen, we have Todd Albaugh in Wisconsin, but their remarks are regret that their party has moved a different direction. In terms of significant Republican electeds willing to go on camera and speak in favor of voting rights, we were not successful. And in fact, the Voting Rights Renewal Act passed in the House in 2018-2019, which would restore pre-clearance and have it not be focused on the South, but rather national pursuant to a formula. A very intelligent bill, in my opinion, was passed by the House, sent to the Senate, where it never received a vote. So I'm disappointed that the Republicans have not shown leadership on these Voting Rights Act issues. By the way, gerrymandering historically has been done by both parties. The Republicans in recent years have been more effective at it than Democrats, but historically the Democrats were never shy about it. And so I don't think voting rights is a partisan issue. I think it's an American issue. And I look forward to both parties acting to ensure the right of every eligible American citizen to vote.
Excellent. Thank you again for such quality and thorough answers. So before we run out of time here and lose people, we want to remind you that October 16th, which would be this Friday, is the last day to register to vote by mail in Douglas County. You'd have to have it postmarked by this Friday. If you want to register to vote in person, you may do that at the Douglas County Election Commission up until October 23rd. And that is at 12220 West Center Road. So it's not too late. We still want everybody to be voting. And with that, I'm going to go back to our 10% of those. Oh, sorry. I want to also say, if you're in Sarpy County, sarpy.com is your website. And then if you want to know anything about any other states or counties, you can go to vote.org. So thank you, Dr. Cynthia Gooch-Grayson, for sharing all that information. Back to the 10% of the individuals who are not able to vote because they do not have identification. How can you let that happen without, how can you allow no voter ID without making it so easy to allow illegal immigrants to vote too?
That's a good question and has a clear answer. I didn't say no voter ID. I said common sense voter ID. Bring a utility bill, a bank statement, a social security card, a government issued ID without a picture, like a VA ID. There has never been a problem establishing identity at the time of voting. Here's how illegal immigrants, or by the way, legal immigrants, neither one is allowed, non-citizen legal immigrants, green card holders are not allowed to vote either because they're not citizens. It's easy to prevent them from voting. Number one, they can't register. You have to be a citizen to register. Some states require proof of citizenship. All states require an affidavit under penalty of perjury promising that you are a citizen at the time you register. And there is not a big problem with people promising they're a citizen when they're not, because they're easily found, and the penalty, it's a felony, and you'll go to jail and then you'll be deported. Just ask Rosa Maria Ortega of Fort Worth, Texas, who told the person at the DMV, I'm a green card holder, what am I supposed to put here? She says that the person told her, say yes, and she did, and she's been a green card holder for a number of years. She was caught, she was convicted, she went to jail, and she was deported. So you go ahead and talk to an immigrant, either legal or illegal, and you ask them whether from their point of view that's a good move to cast one vote and risk felony charges, imprisonment, and deportation. Doesn't happen. And so there is not a significant problem. This has been litigated a number of times, most recently in Kansas, where the Secretary of State there, Mr. Kobach, alleged that there was a very significant problem with illegal immigrants and non-citizens generally registering to vote and voting. And they went over years and years of Kansas history, and I believe they found 3. And so it's, and they were caught. It's not a significant problem. Immigrants don't want to do it, and there are a number of tripwires in the system. Voting is much more secure now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Like many other things in our society, information technology has allowed us to do a lot of great things, and this is one of them. We know who's a citizen, we know who's not.
So we understand that we might lose some people because we're reaching, well, we've passed 12 noon here, but I would like to ask another question that we have prepared. The group we saw in RIG, North Carolina's Voter Integrity Project, seems at times bumbling, other times clearly racist. How did you gain such access to them? And should we worry about grassroots groups like this and others in 2020?
We met them at these, you know, Barbara, your question kind of implies that access would have been hard, you know, to get because they should be secretive or ashamed of what they're doing, but that's not how they see it at all. They believe that our elections are riddled with fraud. Obviously, in months of looking in 2016, they found 0, but that fact hasn't changed their view. They just feel that the fraud's even bigger than they thought, and the perpetrator is even more devious, and they need to keep looking. But they invited us in. We met them at these purging hearings, and they were eager to tell their story. We think it's right to let both sides tell their side of the story. And they invited us to embed with them, and we sat in the back seat of the car with the camera running, which they said would be great because when they found fraud, we'd have it on camera. We thought that was great too. By the way, I hate fraud. I bet you everybody hates fraud. But we've got very good laws that protect against fraud in all 50 states right now. These guys didn't find any fraud. So that's what we end up showing. I think that the point of this part of the film is that these guys feel that what they're doing is patriotic. And they feel that that way because their information sources have told them that the elections are filled with fraud. And all the facts that they've seen to the contrary, they will not be talked out of that belief. So I think everybody needs to grapple with the information tunnel. Mike talks about this a little bit in the film, that many people in our country live in.
Okay, I think we'll go with one last question unless we come up with one in the Q&A. In this election season, the presidential race seems to get all the attention. Can you speak about the importance of down ballot races, which the Republicans did such a good job of focusing on in the last census year?
The headlines are about the presidential race, sometimes about Senate races, but most of our daily lives is governed by state and local races. The quality of education, the quality of transportation, the quality of local policing, many environmental elements are first and foremost local taxation, property tax, infrastructure are largely determined locally, and certainly all these voting provisions are controlled by the states. There's a overarching federal control, but rarely exercised. And so if you're not focusing on state and local races, you're missing a very, very large percentage of the government that affects your daily life. So I would encourage people to learn those races and be active in those races.
Okay, I think I lied. I want to ask one more question, and it's related to what we see going on TV today with the Supreme Court potential new justice being questioned. So with the death of Justice Ginsburg, bringing the Supreme Court front and center, what do you think the role of the courts and the Supreme Court might be this election season? Might they have to weigh in as they did in the 2000 presidential election?
Yeah, they may have to weigh in. And by the way, in 2000, it was only one state, Florida. But this year, it could be multiple states. We'll see what happens. The vote totals may be clear in these various states, but if it's close in a Florida or a Michigan or a Wisconsin, one side or the other may litigate. That litigation may be in state court, maybe in federal court, and may find its way up from the federal district court to the appellate court to the Supreme Court, or from the state Supreme Court to the Supreme Court. Remember that if Judge Barrett is not confirmed and the Supreme Court has only 8 members, and let's say it splits 4-4 on whatever case or cases may be brought before it, the result is that the decision of the lower court will stand. So that means that the federal appellate courts or the state Supreme Court will really be the ones making the decision. So could it happen? Yes. Could it happen in multiple states? Yes. Could it be a mess? Yes, I hope not. I hope our democracy operates well. Nobody wants the election decided in the courts. We want it decided by the voters.
Thank you once again. At this time, I would like to thank our audience for being so attentive and been watching, and we've only increased numbers. We haven't lost anyone. And many, many thanks to Mac Heller for joining us, giving us that opportunity to hear from a producer. Shout out to Jason Lyons from Metro, who has been running the Zoom webinar and doing such an excellent job of that. If you'd like to know more about how you can fight voter suppression, go to the link that Jason is going to post in the chat function. You can get a copy of the Democracy Playbook, which was compiled by the producers of Rigged. It gives voters micro and macro steps which you can take to reclaim our democracy. If you would like to know more about how you can fight voter suppression, he's also putting up the website for the film Rigged, which is in the chat function. So again, we want to remind everybody to register and vote this November. Our democracy depends on everyone taking part. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a very good day. I believe Jason's going to put up a few more slides for us to remind you about completing the online evaluation. You can go to mccneb.edu/IIE-eval. And remember that your continued participation throughout the year could achieve recognition for you. Jason, then another slide we have to tell you what our next event is for the Diversity Matters Film and Lecture Series. It will be in a couple weeks here. The video and discussion still waters. Discussion will be led by Naomi Marduk-Uman, the Director of Faculty Development at Metropolitan Community College. And that's also going to be a Zoom presentation. I want to thank all of you for being with us. We really appreciate your attention to this very important matter. And again, Mac, this is very much enhanced by your willingness to talk with us this morning. Thank you so much. And if there's anything else you wanted to say to the audience, the door's open.
Just thank you. Thanks to everyone for watching. Thank you, Barb, and thanks to MCC for hosting this event.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.